New York has long been a land of opportunity that has attracted people from all over the world, nearly from its inception. Wealthy but also deeply unequal, it has played a major part in nearly every period of American history. To find out why, join me for this brief look at the history and politics of New York. The earliest evidence of human occupation in what is now New York comes in the form of stone tools that have been dated to over 12,000 years ago and were found in the West Athens site in Greene County. In more recent times, just before the arrival of the Europeans, the future state was home to multiple native groups that were loosely affiliated into two large language groups, the Iroquoian in the west and the Algonquian in the east. For the former, these included the Erie, Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Laurentians, and Mohawk. And for the latter, there were the Abenaki, Mohican, Lenape Delaware, Poospatuck, and Mohegan. Their diet, based on the three sisters, beans, squash, and corn, as well as fish, was quite similar across tribes. The major difference was that 5 of the Iroquois groups, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, created a confederacy with a sophisticated representation system with checks and balances that would later inspire Benjamin Franklin, and thus, some have argued, would also inform the development of the U.S. Constitution. The first of these native groups to encounter Europeans were the Lenape Delaware, when in 1524, Giovanni Verrazzano, a Florentine explorer sailing under the French flag, showed up in the area in search of a northern route to Asia, the famed Northwest Passage. Verrazzano followed a northeastern route that took him to the entrance of the Hudson River and later Long Island before he returned to Europe with news of his discovery. Given that the French were enmeshed in European wars, as well as Verrazzano's failure to find the passage, however, led to the French not following up. Instead, it would be Henry Hudson, an Englishman, sailing under the Dutch East India Company who would explore the region further, nearly a century later in 1609. He arrived in Newfoundland, Canada in July of that year and would sail south, reaching the entrance of the river that now bears his name on September 3rd, following it north as far as present-day Albany, where he traded furs with the local indigenous people. Further explorations followed, slowly creating trading networks with the natives and the first non-indigenous settlement in 1614 in what is now New York State, Fort Nassau, later renamed Albany. Demand for furs attracted even more traders. One of those people was Juan Rodriguez, a man born in Santo Domingo of Portuguese and African descent who learned Algonquian and ended up living in Manhattan Island, the first recorded non-native to live in what is now New York City. A new joint stock outfit was then created to manage trade in the area, the Dutch West India Company, which would become the formal authority behind the colony of New Netherland. An effort that would be quite successful, not just because of its commercial goals, but also because its relatively liberal ethos made it a magnet for traders and settlers from across Europe, including Jews, Huguenots, Scandinavians, and Walloons. This in turn would lead to the founding of multiple outposts, including New Amsterdam in 1624, Kingston in 1652, Harlem in 1658, and Schenectady in 1661. Enslaved blacks were also brought by the Dutch West India Company to work on public projects and farms, and they would eventually be allowed to have their own settlement in a place the Dutch called Land of the Blacks, in what is now Greenwich, and Soho in NYC. As the colony continued to grow, it sparked conflict with the natives, most notably during Kieft's War in 1643, largely the result of the ill-advised decisions of Willem Kieft, the Director General of the colony. The armed hostilities saw multiple massacres of natives and the killing of many Europeans, most famously Anne Hutchinson, a prominent religious dissenter who had fled from the Massachusetts Bay Colony to Dutch territory in 1642. Kieft was then sacked and a new Director General appointed, Peter Stuyvesant. The new director set out to rebuild the colony, building walled fortifications in what is now Wall Street, hence the name, and rebuilding the main access to New Amsterdam, Heere Straat, later renamed Broadway by the British because of its unusual width. The reason the British had that chance was because conflict had developed between the Dutch and the neighboring colonies of Connecticut and Massachusetts, as well as with the British Crown itself. This led to armed hostilities between the two powers in 1652, 1665, and 1672. In 1666, taking advantage of how weakly defended New Netherland was, British warships arrived and seized the colony without a fight, renaming it New York in honor of the Duke of York, future King James II. The Dutch managed to reconquer the colony in 1673, but under the Treaty of Westminster, gave up the colony in exchange of British recognition of Suriname. Easing the transition to British rule, the Dutch negotiated articles of capitulation that guaranteed rights to the Dutch colonists. These included religious freedom, recognition of their own customs, and the application of Dutch law to contracts made prior to the capitulation. Under English control, New York expanded as a trading hub. It also gained a representative assembly in 1683 and a charter of liberties and privileges that had the most expansive list of rights of any of the colonies. Political tensions would soon surface, however, and the charter would be revoked a mere 2 years later when New York was incorporated into the Dominion of New England, along with several of the northern colonies. Then, news of the Glorious Revolution back in England sparked Leisler's Rebellion in 1689, a populist uprising led by Jacob Leisler, a German-born merchant who seized power in the name of Protestantism and the common people. This was short-lived. The British would regain power in 1691 and had Leisler executed, but tensions would never disappear completely, even as New York's strategic harbor and fertile hinterlands made the colony the breakfast and lumber yard for the British sugar colonies in the Caribbean. Thus, when discontent with the British crown brought talk of revolution in the 1760s in the other colonies, it did so here with equal force. In 1765, resistance to the Stamp Act exploded in New York City, leading to the formation of the Sons of Liberty and the first coordinated intercolonial resistance. Then, when armed conflict exploded, its strategic geographic position made it the site of multiple key events in the war. These included the capture of Fort Ticonderoga and its artillery in May 1775, which allowed the Patriots to expulse the British from Boston. The Battle of Long Island and White Plains in 1776, which were severe losses for the Patriots, and also allowed the occupation of New York City until the end of the war, which nonetheless did not bring the fatal blow the British were hoping for. Still, none were more important than the Battle of Saratoga, where Horatio Alger and his men were able to prevent the cutting off of New England from the rest of the colonies. This victory not only boosted American morale, but also convinced the French to join the war on the side of the Americans, and later the Dutch and Spanish, as well as paving the way for an eventual American victory in the Revolution. The end of the war in 1781 brought other problems, namely the weakness of the central government under the Articles of Confederation. A constitutional convention in Philadelphia was set up to deal with this. New York's representatives, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and Robert Yates, had plenty of ideas about the creation of a new government, but they disagreed with each other, so it effectively made their vote null. Instead, Hamilton's influence would be much more important after the convention, when he became one of the main pro-ratification voices through the Federalist Papers, although New York itself would become the third to last of the original colonies to ratify, not least because its governor, George Clinton, was vehemently opposed to ratification. Nonetheless, on July 26, 1788, New York became the 11th state and New York City the capital under the new Constitution, which is why George Washington was inaugurated as the first president at Federal Hall in Wall Street. New York City's status as the national capital did not last long, and it did not even become the state capital. That status went to Albany in 1797, mostly because of its location. Nonetheless, even as political power moved away, economic power very much remained in the city. Its strategic importance made it the financial nerve center of the new republic, leading to the creation of several prominent banks such as Citibank in 1825, originally the City Bank of New York. What truly solidified its economic dominance, and subsequently the state's as well, however, was the building of the Erie Canal in 1825, an artificial waterway that linked the Hudson River to the Great Lakes, turning New York City into the entry point for commerce across the American interior. This, in turn, made previous villages such as Rochester, founded in 1788, and Buffalo and Syracuse, first settled in the 1780s, into booming industrial cities. Others, like Utica, incorporated in 1798, also saw significant growth. By 1840, the state was home to 7 of the largest 30 cities in the country. The rising population and increasing literacy, as well as cheap print technology, also opened the way for a major newspaper industry, including the New York Post, founded by Alexander Hamilton in 1801, the oldest continuously daily still in print. The New York Sun, established in 1833, which pioneered selling its daily for just a penny, and of course the New York Times, which was founded in 1853 and would establish its reputation as the paper of record from 1896 on. The state during this period also produced the first American author to gain international recognition, Washington Irving. Born in New York City in 1783, his stories, Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, made him famous. Economic growth encouraged the founding of multiple important universities in the state, including Syracuse in 1840, the University of Buffalo in 1847, the University of Rochester in 1850, and of course Cornell in 1865. But it also brought social upheaval as the state became a center of reform and revival. The burnt-over district of Western New York earned its name from the intense religious fervor of the Second Great Awakening, a Protestant movement that attracted thousands of new converts and led to the creation of several new Protestant denominations, the largest of which today are the Latter-day Saints, better known as Mormons. Movements to abolish slavery, grant women the vote, and temper the sale of alcohol also found fertile ground here. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, the first major women's rights meeting in U.S. history, took place along the Erie Canal's path, a clear example of how commerce and culture intertwined. Likewise, people like Sojourner Truth, a former enslaved person born in Riften, who became one of the first black women to sue a white man and win, Frederick Douglass, a former enslaved man from Maryland who moved to Rochester and founded the abolitionist paper The North Star, and Gerrit Smith, a rich man who made Peterborough, the place where he lived, a main hub in the Underground Railroad that helped enslaved people escape north, all became national figures. New York had abolished slavery in 1827, but as a result of the abolition movement, it also passed personal liberty laws, which aimed to give some legal protection to fugitives fleeing enslavement, and committed the state to help any resident who might have been kidnapped into slavery. It was this law that helped rescue Solomon Northup, a man who later wrote a celebrated memoir that became the basis for the movie 12 Years a Slave. Thus, naturally, when arguments over slavery sparked the Civil War in 1861, New York sided with the Union, providing the most soldiers for the U.S. Army than any other state. The post-war years brought continued economic growth as New York consolidated its dominance of the financial and banking industries, and manufacturing continued to expand. New banks like Chase Manhattan and insurers like New York Life were founded, as well as prominent companies like Kodak, an enterprise specializing in cameras and photography, Endicott Johnson, a shoe manufacturer, and Singer, a sewing machine company. This would bring about the Gilded Age for the rich, best exemplified by people like railroad magnates Cornelius Vanderbilt and Jay Gould, as well as socialites like Caroline Astor. New York also became the gateway to America. Millions of immigrants, particularly from Southern and Eastern Europe, poured into New York City. Many settled in teeming tenement districts like the Lower East Side, forming ethnic enclaves, reshaping the city's cultural fabric and powering the state's economic growth. This was best symbolized by Ellis Island, although by the time it opened in 1892, the growth in immigration was already well underway. The Statue of Liberty, which had been dedicated in 1886 and was originally intended as a celebration of democracy rather than immigration, also became associated with the newcomers because a poem by Emma Lazarus, originally written to fundraise for the building of the statue's pedestal, was placed there in 1903 as a memorial to Lazarus, who died when she was barely 38. The other great migration to the state came from the South as black people fled north, attracted by industrial jobs and lack of Jim Crow laws. This would eventually result in the Harlem Renaissance, which produced the likes of writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, and made the city into a beacon of black creativity and intellectualism. Simultaneously, the state was a site of innovation and contradiction. Central Park was completed in 1876 with the radical idea at the time of a shared civic space open to all classes, and yet to complete it, a black community known as Seneca Village was seized and destroyed. Likewise, it was here that Tammany Hall, a political machine known for corruption and patronage, operated even as labor unions, muckraking journalists, and reformers like Al Smith and Francis Perkins pushed for minimum wages, housing reform, and safety laws. It is not a coincidence that two of New York's politicians from this period, who would go on to become U.S. presidents, Chester Arthur and Theodore Roosevelt, would concentrate on fighting corruption. Arthur in particular was instrumental in the passage of the Pendleton Act, which established a merit-based system for federal employment. Meanwhile, after the tragic Triangle Shirtwaist Fire of 1911, which killed 146 workers, many of them immigrant women, New York became a leader in progressive labor legislation. Then the Depression hit, with its epicenter at Wall Street, where the stock market crashed in 1929, eventually causing the state's unemployment rate to spike to a whopping 25%. Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, and Schenectady were hit especially hard as factories laid off thousands due to collapsing demand for steel, machinery, and automobiles, while farmers in western and central New York suffered from falling crop prices and mounting debt. The city saw the rise of shanty towns and breadlines, but even as a third of its workers were unemployed, iconic skyscrapers like the Empire State and Chrysler buildings were built because they took advantage of the cheaper labor. New York's governor at the time, Franklin D. Roosevelt, tried to deal with economic problems in the state by pioneering many of the social programs that would later become the backbone for his New Deal policies as president, including an expanded public works and infrastructure program as well as a Temporary Emergency Relief Administration, or TIRA, one of the earliest state-level unemployment relief programs in the country. World War II would bring the economic crisis to an end, but would also cost New York the largest number of casualties of any state. The end of the war, meanwhile, brought the headquarters of the UN to the city, the creation of the SUNY system to meet the demand for higher education that had been unleashed by the returning GIs, the construction of the Newark Thruway starting in 1954, and the growth of suburbia. Levittown, the first mass-produced suburb in the country, was built in Long Island for returning GIs in 1947. It would be the first of many. Industry would also continue to grow and evolve. IBM, one of the most important technology companies in the world, had been founded in Endicott in 1917, and in the 50s not just expanded along the southern tier, but also created the first commercial computer in 1952, as well as the first magnetic hard disk drive and use of artificial intelligence, both in 1956. Likewise, Xerox became a major corporation after Joseph C. Wilson revitalized what had been the Haloid Photographic Company, a company founded in Rochester through the introduction of the first commercial photocopier, Xerox 914, in 1959. As the Cold War developed, it also fueled economic clusters like that of aircraft manufacturing in Nassau County, based on the expansion of the Grumman Corporation, as well as electronics in Syracuse and Binghamton. This all helped make New York the state with the largest GDP in the country. The 1970s marked a turning point, however. Increased global competition, automation, and the shifting of manufacturing to the South because of cheaper labor costs and less regulation hit upstate New York hard and begun a painful process of deindustrialization. This in turn led to population decline, which fueled further economic contraction. Buffalo in particular saw its population contract by half by 2000. Schenectady, Utica, and Troy saw similar trends starting in the 1950s. This dynamic took longer to reach New York City, but by 1970 it finally did. Even worse, this population decline, coupled with chronic budget deficits and a shrinking tax base, led the city to face bankruptcy in 1975, worsening public services and subsequent crime surge in the 1980s. The 1990s reversed this trend in NYC, and revitalization efforts in Albany, Buffalo, and Rochester put the state on a better path. But what truly turned the state around was the rise of new industries in tech, healthcare, and media, bringing prosperity to areas connected to universities, even as it recovered from the horror of the 9/11 attacks in 2001. The other bright spot in the state has been tourism. The Finger Lakes, Adirondacks, Hudson Valley, and Niagara Falls also gains through regional branding, craft food, beverage, and ecotourism, while NYC has regained its status as a global destination. Nonetheless, problems remain, not least the cost of housing, which has become a huge issue. Meanwhile, uneven development has made the division between upstate and downstate more stark, given that the tech corridors that have developed in Buffalo, Syracuse, and Albany, and elsewhere, have not been big enough to counter the deindustrialization that occurred. The other issue that has been a constant during this time has been political scandals, starting with Governor Eliot Spitzer, who got caught in a high-end prostitution ring in 2007, and continuing with corruption convictions of multiple state leaders, both Democrat and Republican, including Joe Bruno, Sheldon Silver, Dean Skillos, Pedro Espada, and too many more to list. Then there was the resignation of Governor Andrew Cuomo because of accusations of sexual harassment and the FBI investigation of NYC Mayor Eric Adams for alleged illegal foreign campaign contributions. And thus, although New York now finds itself as the third state with the largest GDP, it faces major challenges, and as it is looking for ways to improve on some of these problems, its citizens have become disillusioned with their politicians. Whether New York's leaders can put the state back on track will have huge consequences, not just for itself, but for the country.